Before joining the University of Hankuk, Dr. Lussier worked for the University of Sussex, UK, the World Bank, and a range of development organizations across the continent of Africa. Dr. Lussier specializes in education and development. She has extensive experience in having worked on the education sector in African institutions. Today's lecture is based on one of our project experiences in Africa. I warmly welcome Dr. Lussier on with you and request her to go. She will speak for 20 minutes or so, which will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer session.
Thank you very much for receiving me in your university. I feel quite privileged to kick off with the special lectures for 2013. So happy New Year to everybody. So India is my 50th country, so I'm really privileged to be here. Obviously, as you can see, I am not Korean. I am originally Canadian. I have a doctorate in development studies, but most of my life I have been working on education. My background is in special education from Canada, but I have been working in schools in Bolivia. I lived 4 years in Vietnam, and I've been doing consultancies and research work in a wide range of countries. So this lecture is based on a paper that I presented at the conference on the human development and capability approach. The Teacher Preparation in Africa project is really my starting point. This is a research project that was conducted by the Center for International Education at the University of Sussex with Professor John Pryor, Joe Westbrook, and Kwame Acheampong. So what we were really looking at was how teacher preparation impacts on teaching practices in Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, Mali, Tanzania, and Uganda. So more specifically, we were researching how knowledge, understanding, and practice vary between teacher trainees, newly qualified teachers, and experienced teachers. The findings from the TPA project strongly resonated with my experience both in Vietnam and Latin America. So this made me want to explore the extent to which official development assistance investment in education were supporting teacher preparation and how teacher preparation figured in national development policies. The importance of education for development is recognized in several global development initiatives. So the Millennium Development Goals have a good component on education. Obviously, MDG 2 on universal education, but also MDG 3 because the target of the MDG in terms of gender equality looks specifically at the gender disparity in primary and secondary education. But also, education supports other MDGs as well, because education is strongly linked to health, to environment, to economic development. But education is also part of other important indexes when we think about development. One of them is the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and the other one is the Human Development Index. So both of these indexes have an education component relating to that. Education and development are closely linked. Obviously, to get a good job, you need to have some knowledge and some skills. Knowledge and skills a lot of daily life activities. And you have to buy medicine either for you or for your children. You need to be able to understand what is written on the label in order to be able to give the right quantity of medicine. If you have no ideas of numbers, of proportions, it's going to be more difficult to give the right amount of medicine to your children, which can either exacerbate the problem, make the health situation worse, or if you happen to do it well, solve the problem. But also, if you want people to be able to engage in social processes, in economic activities, in democratic processes, basic knowledge of how to read and write, of human rights, of mathematics, are essential to engage as active citizens. And education, as I just mentioned, is related to health, environment, income generation, and several others. Just imagine having a little shop and not being able to count, not being able to understand the numbers. What would happen? Well, obviously, you might be ripped off. If you're a farmer in rural areas and you have no idea of the value of your products, then you rely on middlemen being honest, which is not necessarily the case. So education can make a huge difference in people's everyday life, in all countries. But when development actors talk about education, they often look at big numbers. So this was taken from the World Development Report 2012, and it looks at gender parity in education. And from those pictures, we could say that we're doing really well. Okay? So some African countries lag behind in terms of primary education. Gender gaps in secondary education are a little bit higher, but somehow it's reducing. And the figure is telling us that women are more likely to participate in higher education than men. So good round of applause, everybody. The international development community has been doing very well, isn't it? Well, at least this is what the figures suggest. We have to be careful. Rough interpretation of data can be very misleading. There are a few things that we need to interrogate very critically. First is the difference between education and schooling. Boosting numbers of children sitting on a chair in a classroom is different from children being able to do something with what they receive. Knowledge, skills, attitudes, all these can be learned through education, but not necessarily because a kid is sitting in a classroom. We have around the world fantastic experiences where children are being educated outside of school. For example, in Kenya, where you have mobile schools for nomadic children. These are taking place outside of the formal setting. Yet, those children manage to learn all the essentials that they need to make a good livelihood and improve their well-being. Another thing that the statistics, I personally have a big problems with a lot of the figures that we see about education around the world. Why? Because they don't often make the difference between enrollment and completion. So many countries have been boosting the numbers of children actually enrolling in the classroom. But does that mean that they complete primary school? Does that mean that they complete secondary school? And often there are really big gaps. Another one is between attendance and achievement. Being present in the classroom doesn't necessarily mean that you understand what is going on. It doesn't necessarily mean that children are learning something. And to some extent, I think everybody here probably have an experience of sitting in a lecture while thinking about something else. I am sure that if we all think back about our education experience, we can all point out about a particular moment where we were physically there, but can't say a thing about what has been going on. Now, obviously, if you are squeezed in a room with 125 other little children, and it's really, really hot, and you're really, really hungry, and sometimes, you're just looking forward to be out and do other things, and the teacher is talking in front and not really engaging with you, you may have absolutely no clue of what is going on. So attendance, being there, doesn't mean that you have acquired the knowledge of the skills that the teacher wanted to transmit. So how meaningful is the learning? This is the key questions that we should ask ourselves. Now, when we think about women accessing higher education, who are these women accessing higher education? I did some research for the Center for Higher Education and Equity Research, also the University of Sussex, on a project called the Widening Participation in Higher Education, and we found that different structures of marginalization combine together and reinforce exclusion. Now, this might be different in India, but in Africa we see that there are increasing numbers of women in education, in higher education. However, these women tend to be women from privileged backgrounds. If we intersect other structures of marginalization, such as poverty, disability, age, then the woman disappears. Okay, so women from poor backgrounds are still not present in universities, while men from a lower socioeconomic status have more chances, although still more limited, but they have more chances of accessing higher education. But if you happen to be visible and a girl, too bad. If you happen to be poor and a girl, too bad. If you are one or the other, then you have some chances. So people being marginalized in more than one aspect have little chances of completing higher education. If you're lucky, you will get in, but life opportunities may be such that at some point during your degree you will have to drop out. If your mother is sick, then you have to give up university to take care of your younger siblings. So still, even though the numbers look positive, there are a lot of challenges ahead. So, the international community is really happy because we have greatly reduced the number of children from primary school age who are out of school. At the moment, according to the latest EFA report, it was 61 million. 42% of them live in conflict-affected countries. However, 120 million children do not reach grade 4. And 130 million children are in school but don't manage to learn the basics. They do not manage to learn the way that you can actually use them in everyday life, as well as literacy, being able to read and write. So that means that at least 250 million children in the world cannot read or count, even if they have spent 4 years in school. And for me, we have to change our focus. We have to stop looking at the 61 million children who are out of school. They are important, but the 250 million children is where our energy should go. Because being sitting on a chair for 4 years, if you cannot do anything with it, for me, it's a waste of development money. It's a waste of money from the countries as well. We have to find a solution to those problems. Okay? But we also have to pay attention to how patterns of access and progression vary within countries. So I took those two figures from the 2012 Global Monitoring Report because they are from India. So we can see over here, and I apologize, it's quite small, but you can see the differences between Tamil Nadu and Gujarat at the back over there. So regional differences. The second is a comparison between Congo, Liberia, Namibia, Uganda, Madagascar, Kenya, and India. And we can see that the richer people are doing fantastically well. But the poorest one, there's again a big gap between those who enter primary school and those who complete. Okay, so the first mark on the top is when they enter, and the arrow is completion. So in different regions, we have a much bigger difference between entrance and completion, but it also varies based on the socioeconomic status. Education can be a very good catalyst for poverty reduction, but sitting in classroom is not enough. Children have to learn. Now, while the international community is realizing that quality matters, teacher preparation is still overlooked. Now, the focus on quality is a really good news. But what does quality education mean? Quality education, if you're sitting in a ministry in Tanzania, can be completely different from the understanding that a teacher in a classroom in Kerala would understand quality. My view is that we should look at learning, because at least this has resonance everywhere. If you're trying to teach a kid to do 3 plus 5, and at the end of the day, the kid tells you 10, then you know that something went wrong. Then you know that more work needs to be done. There is a crisis in early grade teaching. Why? Because there has been a huge increase in the number of children in school. Okay? So from between 1999 and 2010, we talk about 50 million more children in schools in sub-Saharan Africa, and 33 million in South and West Asia. It's easy to build classrooms. It's easy to tell people now education is compulsory, you have to send your children 2 or 3 years process. But this is not enough to cope with the demand on teachers. So they have other parallel systems. For example, in Mali we talk about the volunteer of education, where you would go through a crash course, 3 months, and then teach. In Senegal, it's even worse, 6 weeks to prepare a teacher. So there's a huge pressure on education systems. But that's not the only problem. Another problem is that many children enter school with disadvantages that make their learning more difficult. Before, those who used to go to school were from families that valued education, who were willing to support or had the knowledge to support their children. Increasingly, the children who are getting into the school have poorer health. They are less likely to have the opportunity to attend preschool. Their parents are also less likely to be educated, so less able to support their learning. Increased number of children from a more varied background, increasing children who are more vulnerable to learning challenges, and teachers trying to cope with all of that. So, 650 million children of primary school age, 250 million can't read or write, whether in school or not. This is the picture that we have in front of us. So in 1/3 of countries, at least 1/4 of primary school teachers were not trained to the national standards. In Sub-Saharan Africa and Southwest Asia, pupil-teachers ratio have worsened since 1999. So obviously, more children going to school mean bigger classrooms. If you have to teach how to read to 25 children, and if you have to teach how to read to 100 children, it's a different game. You have to adapt your methods, you have to adapt your practices. Yet, there's a big assumption that teachers will be able to do the shift, that they will know how to cope with this situation. But the reality is telling us that it's not as simple as that. That teachers need to be supported in order to be able to adapt to the changing realities of classrooms all over the world. This is a comparison that I did of the 6 countries that the TPA project was looking at. This is the current focus of official development assistance to education. Okay? So here you have the number of interventions by category of ODA between 2000 and 2010. So look at the column of teacher education. In total, we had 18 for initial teacher education, 111 for continuing professional development, and 45 were on defined, addressing, issues in a broader perspective. Now, if we compare training to non-teaching personnel and technical assistants, 391. Infrastructure, 405. Administration, 485. There is a lot of investment in education. countries, from a region of the world where we know education is a big problem. Yet, there have been so much more investment in infrastructure and into capacity building of non-teaching education-related personnel than in teacher education. And for me, this is not logic. This is taking the problem upside down. While teacher preparation is a priority for many governments, aid does not contribute so much to solve the challenges. UNESCO estimates that 2 million additional teachers will be needed by 2050. The little interest in initial teacher education may undermine others' interventions' effectiveness. A lot of money goes into curriculum development, into providing material for the classroom. And of course, this is very important. However, if you have books, if you have curriculums, even though they're good, if the teachers cannot use them, what's the point? I have seen, for example, lovely little books, okay, to address to grade 1 and 2 children. However, if the teacher put the book in the middle of the table and you have children sitting all around them, and then you tell the children, this is A for Africa, B for boat. And one little kid see the A like this, and the other little kids see the A like that, and the other one see it like this, and the other one see it like that. It's going to be a problem. Equally important, if the little kid has no idea what the boat is, because he speaks another language at home, and in his language, the word for boat doesn't start with the sound, it sounds like the mental image is not producing any support to the learning. The child has much more difficulties understanding because he looks at the picture, think about the word, and then is told that this is the letter that goes with the word. And yet, all these things have not been included that influences their understanding of what education should be. And that introduces a bias. It's not wrong, but we have to be aware of it if we want to be able to challenge those assumptions. Many people think that if you know something well, you can make others learn it. But this needs to be challenged as well. It's not because you know that 3 times 2 is 6 that you can make a child understand it. You have to find ways to explain it. Some people are really good at it, but some people have to learn it. And we cannot assume that going through a basic teacher program will provide the teachers enough pedagogical content knowledge, enough tools to help those children master the concept and understand it. Of course, they can memorize tables. Memorizing is easy. But if you only memorize and you don't understand why 2 times 3 is 6, later on, when you enter the working market or you try to use those skills in a little shop or trying to help the parents selling goats or dealing with the eggs that the hen have produced, you can't rely on memorization anymore. And this is why, if we want education to make a contribution to development, to help families to improve their well-being, we have to go beyond that. We have to make sure that it's genuine learning, that children just don't memorize random things, but they can understand them and use them in their daily life. There's another assumption, is that higher level knowledge are harder to teach. And because of that, they deserve more time. But it's not necessarily the case. Because the fundamentals are critical and they need more attention. In the country we studied, a big proportion of the teacher training actually focused on reviewing higher secondary knowledge and skills. So they spend a lot of time learning algebra, but not on how to teach basic knowledge. Now, the teacher may be really good with algebra, but the children, unless they master the fundamentals, won't be able to do it. So we need to invest more time in teaching teachers how to teach those basic skills if we want some changes to take place. If children are unable to learn the basics early on, then chances of acquiring other skills in later grades are slim. So pedagogical content knowledge, which means basically pedagogical knowledge specific to each content that you're trying to teach, is really important. One thing that I've seen a lot is teachers learning procedures. There is another idea about education, is that teaching is a little bit like baking a cake or making a curry. If you follow the different steps, learning will follow. I wish that it was that easy. Unfortunately, following a script won't work. not be enough. I'll give you an example. In our visits in the classroom was a teacher who had learned that to teach fraction, a really effective way was to use oranges. So she followed a really strict procedure. Introductions, manipulation, then she had drawings on the board, and she followed all the steps. And the little kids were really happy. I mean, you have kids, you have oranges, you have knife, and the kids are allowed to take the knife and play with the oranges. All the kids would be happy with that, right? So the kids were happy. She had followed the recipe step by step. She was happy. That was a really successful lesson. The challenge is, she was teaching children about 1/3. Have you tried cutting an orange in three? Next time you play with oranges or you eat an orange, try to cut it in three and have a really even part of orange. Now imagine 8-year-old kids trying to cut the orange in three. So you may have children who had just cut the orange in 4 and took 3 parts. Now, that would work if you're trying to teach 3/4, but if you're trying to teach 1/3, that doesn't really match. You see, and then you have the children who had just eaten their orange. And you had children who had, just cut whatever, and you had children who did manage to cut the orange in 3, but with 1 really big part and 2 really small ones. Now, conceptually, do you think they will get the idea of a third? No. Yet, for the teacher, this was a really successful lesson. And indeed, based on the criteria that she had learned during her initial teacher education, she had followed all the steps. She had used all the material that were prescribed. It should have been a very successful lesson, yet it did not translate in learning. Children were somehow maybe even more confused after, because they can see 3 parts on the blackboard, and then they have 4 parts of orange, and it's all a bit confused. So kids had fun. They probably went home really happy. But if we think about learning, this was a wasted lesson. And wasted resources as well. Because in an environment where resources are scarce, then the orange could have been used in a better purpose. So there are limitations in teacher preparation. And again, I would be really happy to see whether these resonate to your own experience here in India. So in the country studied by TPA, many teachers leave the teacher training colleges without the professional disposition and understanding needed to make a positive difference in children learning. Well, first of all, teachers do not learn how to work effectively in multilingual environments. People often assume that children, being really social beings, they will pick up languages easily. Okay? So if you have a child moving into a new area, and even though they don't speak the language at home, just leaving them in the classroom will be enough. Well, they might they usually pick up the language. Unfortunately, often they don't really learn what they are supposed to learn. So, if you're trying to read, obviously, you have a problem if you try to associate things with words that makes no meaning to you. But it's also in mathematics. A method that is used a lot in the 6 countries we study is to make role play with the teachers. Okay? So basically, one teacher trainee will pretend to be the teachers, and the other one will pretend to be children. Okay? So they will try to teach they will ask little Johnny 3 sticks plus 2 sticks, and then maybe the teacher who's playing the role of little Johnny will say 5. But sometimes, they know that children don't always get it, right? So they will say 6, and then the teacher will say, no, Johnny, count with me. 1 stick, 2 sticks, 3 sticks, 4 sticks, 5 sticks. And then they say, okay, so let's try again. 3 sticks plus 2 sticks. And then the teacher who's playing the role of Johnny will say 5 sticks. So everybody is happy. In real life, this may not be what is happening. Because little Johnny is struggling with trying to figure out what does the word stick mean. And then he's told 1 stick, 2 sticks, 3 sticks. But yesterday the teacher said these were fingers. So Johnny is all mixed up. Because rather than thinking about the 3 plus 2, he's thinking, what the hell does stick mean? And how come this suddenly becomes a stick? And what is that little bit of wood on my desk? And all these things are happening in the child's head at the same time. Okay? But obviously, if you're pretending to be a child, you're not going to go into this thought process. Okay? So role plays are really effective, but it can be fairly limited because it's really hard for us adults to really think like children. And another challenge is that teachers are often not prepared for multigrade teaching. Because there's a big gap problems with recruiting teachers, often in rural and remote areas, they have to put many grades together. Now, this is a type of teaching that can be really productive if you learn how to manage a multi-grade classroom. Again, there's the assumption that teachers will be able to cope. But in practice, they cope, but in a way that limits possible learning from both groups of children. Strategies for multi-grade teaching have been documented. Unfortunately, because the time in teacher preparation is so limited, most teachers don't learn about that. Another one is that there's a big gap between schools in rural and urban areas. So often, the practices are done in schools that are located near the universities or the teacher training colleges, depending on the countries. Now, the schools who are near teacher training colleges tend to receive a little bit more funding. They tend to have better teachers, more experienced ones. So, student teachers learn that this is a normal classroom. And often when they go to the rural areas and then they say, oh, but I have a blackboard but I don't have chalk, and now I don't have money to buy chalk. Or there's a hole in the roof. When it rains I have to close the classrooms. Or I have no cupboard, I have no material, I have no book. What do I do? Now, an excellent teacher do not need books to teach how to read and write. Learning the basics is not about having fantastic material. It's about being able to perceive affordances, to be able to see with within your environment what you can use. Now obviously that requires a lot more work from the teachers, however, and it's not an ideal situation. But when teachers are well prepared, they can still teach with really limited resources. And I'm speaking for experience because I have been teaching really underprivileged schools in Bolivia. And I have been seeing those children later on, and I can testify that even without books, they were able to read and write. But obviously, I'm a special ed teacher. I have learned how to deal with that. I have those strategies, which is often not the case in many countries. So there's also a lack of strategies to work with huge groups of children. And another one is that newly qualified teachers feel that they have to do like senior teachers in school. So the socialization process of new teachers into the working environment can make a big difference on whether or not newly qualified teachers will apply what they have learned during their teacher preparation. In some countries, age is really important. So younger teachers have to be responsive to what older professors would say. Okay? So if they're told that this is the way that they should be teaching mathematics or reading or sciences, then they feel that they have to comply. Okay? This is understandable, but at the same time, it limits the effectiveness of innovation in initial teacher education. So unless there is some support, some visits, some discussions with the other groups of teachers, and this is where the international community have been doing quite well in continuing development programs for teachers, then it is unlikely that even good ideas in initial teacher education will actually be implemented in the actual school. So initial teacher education and continuing development programs should go hand in hand to have a better impact. Okay? But it is possible for the governments to collaborate with the international community so they can support the different programs actually support each other. But some changes are needed. The Education for All and the MDGs were mainly focusing on access. Initial teacher education is too often seen as a complement to secondary school. Classroom practice focus on teachers' delivery of predetermined knowledge packages. Teachers are trained to reproduce the steps they have learned, not to reflect on possible ways to help pupils. I argue that if education is to contribute to increasing children's life opportunities, teachers need to be able to make connections between the content in the curriculum and children's own living conditions. So classroom practices are not something that is set in stone. It's something that has to be adapted to the particular situations, but also to the children and those teachers are working with. But this is something that has to be learned. How are we going to do that? Okay. having a degree or a primary school completion certificate will provide you in life. Now, in some cases, just saying that you completed primary school may be enough. But most of the time, what you need is the actual knowledge and understandings of what is on the primary school curriculum, the secondary school curriculum, or the university degree. Okay? At some point in time, you will have to use those knowledge and skills. So the connection between teaching and learning can be more or less strong. Sometimes when you teach, you do your little one-man, one-woman show in front of the classrooms, and the children will learn. But it's not always the case. You can be a really good actor in front of the classroom, but you will not necessarily be able to have all the children learn. So this has to be checked. This is why formative evaluation is so important. If you just deliver content, but you do not check whether the children have understood it, okay? If you do not check that they know that the cow is a cow and not a cat, maybe they got it wrong. So sometimes you will have to repeat. And having to teach something again does not mean you're a bad teacher. It just means that you have to find different ways to reach the children. And this is a mindset that we have to undo with the teachers. It's not about being a good teacher. It's not about doing the thing and it works. We do not have magic wands. Okay? Harry Potter and the like, it's a movie and a books. Good teaching is about being able to identify how to reach the different children, how to respond to their need, to make them learn. And putting pressure on teachers to complete the curriculum, to have taught the whole program, can sometimes create negative impact because you see teachers rushing to cover content. So children, some of the children can actually complete the test or respond to the exam. But because they do it so fast, then they end up teaching only for the strong ones. And the majority of the children will be completely lost. Sometimes it's worth slowing it down and making sure that what children learn, they learn well. So after, they can keep progressing. But unfortunately, in many places, the reward system for the teachers and the schools and the way schools are evaluated assumes that everything has to be covered. And that means teachers rushing through things rather than really focusing on learning. So sitting in the classroom does not necessarily help children to acquire the freedom they need to lead the kind of life they have reasons to live. Blindly going through sequences of activity does not mean that children are learning. Teaching must be adapted to particular classroom conditions, and teacher trainees need to learn how to do that. In September, the UN General Secretary made a big call for the international community to put education first, saying that wherever he goes in the world, there's one thing that parents want, and it's their children to go to school. I tend to disagree with that. I would say that what every parent wants is their children to learn enough to be able to have a good life. And I say that unless we start looking at that education development combination in that way, we are not going to achieve our targets. Education's purpose should be to support children in acquiring the functioning that will enable them to improve their well-being and leave behind the various unfreedoms and problems and marginalizations that they face. Learning is the process through which this is possible. But for that, we need to rethink the way we finance development-related, education-related development interventions and put more focus on teacher education. So pre-service training often does not prepare teachers adequately for early grades. Teacher educators often have no practical experience of primary classrooms. Development actors such as NGOs and bilateral projects provide positive input, but often they do not reach enough teachers to make a difference. So considering professional development are really helpful, but they are too limited to have a big impact. And this is why we have to strengthen initial teacher education. Teachers' capability to foster learning. This is where I believe we should put our energy. That includes teachers being able to perceive and respond to children's needs, to use teaching and learning materials in a way that effectively promote pupils' conceptual understanding, practice formative and diagnostic assessment, and use them to monitor pupils' comprehension and respond to their learning needs. Seek affordances in their working environment and turn them into learning opportunities. By that I mean being able to perceive possibilities to act. Some people, if they have a desk and they need to tighten a screw because it's a little bit shaky, they will say, I need a screwdriver. If I don't have a screwdriver, I cannot do it. Other people will see the affordances. They will say, I don't have a screwdriver, but I have a ruler, or I have a knife, or I have a really strong nail, and I can still do that. If teachers can perceive the possibilities to act within their own environment, they will be more able to support the learning of the children in their classrooms. That requires some level of imagination, but it also requires that they have been trained and taught to think differently and to look for opportunities. It can make a significant contribution to improving education around the world. Teacher preparation at the moment is the weakest link that limits the effectiveness of other interventions in education. And access is not enough.
one similarity which I can think is like we also found a lot of problem in terms of children's learning happening. And we also tried in the same way, like we also tried to script the learning process for the teacher in the form of teacher handbooks. And we have observed in the also observed in our classroom observation, like teachers follow very carefully these scripts, even in terms of activities. If the handbooks tell, take 3 sticks, they will take only 3 sticks and go to the classroom with all the sticks. So it was like one of the ways in which we tried to address it was like making a lot of teacher handbooks. And this teacher handbooks acted as like a strict guidelines from the policy makers and curriculum. So they sat and wrote it, and they mentioned that this is the way that classroom will happen. So we are also baking cakes.
Well, I have learned to teach in a similar way as well. We had the little books, and then we had to follow day by day. They would tell us what to do and things like that. And it was working fairly well for the average child. But the problem is then when you try to factor in those with special needs, and these are increasingly coming into the classrooms, then we find that the cake ends up being either too sweet or too bitter for the children to take it and to eat it. So, I think the solution lies into the right balance and having different options to adapt the script based on the reality of the classrooms. But perhaps as well, we need to spend more time in rural classrooms with huge numbers of children where we can develop more solutions for more challenging situations. And we have to admit that it's tiring to go in a car for hours and hours and hours to go observe what is happening in rural area when we have a school where we could go that is next door or 2 street corners. Good questions. You don't have to agree with me. I'm happy if you want to challenge me.
Thanks for a lot of emphatic statements. I think a lot of elements that resonated so much with the Indian experience about, we're quite disturbed at the ways in which, starting off, at least the curriculum recently of the teacher education program has been kind of being revisited, and we do have a national curriculum framework for teacher education. But we move into the aspects of, who the teachers are, what is really happening in schools, what's the kind of support. A lot of things were quite resonating with what our Indian experiences. I'm particularly interested in knowing, because you were saying there should be need for more investment in the initial teacher education. What about from your African experience of the quality of the initial teacher education program itself? Do you have anything specific? Is it, well, you did say that there are crash courses to 6 weeks, but a university approved initial teacher education program. What is the quality of that?
The quality varies quite a lot, but what was a real shock to me is that, for example, when we compare the 2 types of programs in Valley, we found that there wasn't much differences. So the impacts were as great for the short-term program than the longer one. Why? It's because a lot of
when as per we know, many of the ministers in India don't have the idea about primary education, and maybe he was managing another department, maybe Ministry of Coal, something like that. So I want to know what is your suggestion about that?
Well, I think the problem is usually you wouldn't put someone in the Ministry of Agriculture that know nothing about agriculture. But education is because we have all been to school, so there is that assumption that because we've all been primary school children at some point, we know about it. And it's this mindset that we need to challenge. Because in some countries, they are increasingly, encouraging people with an education background to take up those functions. But it is also about valuing more the lower level of education. Because often, primary school teachers are much less valued than secondary school or college teachers or university teachers. And somehow we make the assumption that all form of teaching is the same. Okay? If you have taught in a university, then surely you should be able to teach 5, 6, 7-year-olds. But every parent in the room would know that 6, 7 years old do not necessarily react and behave in the same way as university students. Again, I'm making an assumption here. But you see, it's about our understanding of it. It's about, I think, valuing more the people who are doing the work, especially at lower primary. Because again, I have seen in many countries that if you teach standard 6, 7, you're fairly well perceived. If you teach grade 1 or 2, you're seen as less good. However, it's much harder to teach at lower level. And the importance of early grade is huge. Because if children are not well prepared, they will never reach the higher level. Because those who struggle most are likely to have already dropped out before they reach grade 6 and above. So the challenges are different.